All right. Let's look backwards. So what do we remember from either last week or previous weeks? So we can pick back up. We'll definitely meet next week. I don't know if we'll meet Palm Sunday. I think there's too many logistics going on. The donkey, for one. I think I'm in charge of making sure the donkey is where the donkey's supposed to be. So yeah, that's what I'll be doing. 9:15 to 10, I'll be making sure those things are happening. And then we won't meet Easter, I don't think. So, but I think we can get through, there's 6 of these pictures. I think we can get through them all today and next week. We did sacrifice and the next one last week. Sacrifice and victor, I think. But I added some stuff to those 2, and then there's 4 more. So if we can at least cover 3 today, 3 next week, I think we're in good shape. But what do we remember from last week or previous weeks about what we've talked about so far? I would say there's no wrong answers, but there are.
We missed last week, so we're innocent of ignorance.
Okay. What about from 2 weeks? It could be from 2 weeks ago.
That's a long time to ask me to remember something.
Yeah, I know. It was almost last month.
Kidding.
Well, it was important that Christ died for us on the cross. It was mentioned in the Old Testament and fulfilled in the New Testament.
Yep. And we did I think it was 2 weeks ago, we did the picture with the puzzle, just to kind of solidify. You've got the puzzle pieces. Some people could figure out some part of the picture, but nobody actually had the entire picture. So we kind of have the same thing going on with these, you could call them metaphors that are trying to capture what happens on the cross. They all have some literal element to them, but they're all also going beyond the literal. So in sacrifice, for instance, if we're saying Christ offers perfect worship on our behalf, we're thinking back to Leviticus in particular, where the Israelites offer an animal in order to cover their sins. And that word cover in the Old Testament is kippur, which is what we get atonement from. But it's a little, some of the difficulty, and we won't get too far into it, is if you think back all the way to the first week, we talked about atonement is a made-up word that I think it was John Wycliffe. It was either Wycliffe or Tyndale. In any case, it's at one-ment. So it literally means what it sounds like. And it was a way of trying to capture what some of these biblical words were pointing at. And so it's not, when we say cover, I left that in there because that's literally what the word means. It's it's covering the sin so that it's not offensive in the sight of God, or it can also mean to wipe clean. So in some ways, it's kind of doing both things. It's shielding the sin from God's sight, but it's also cleansing, in this case, the altar, so that the altar stays pure and clean. So when Jesus dies on the cross, if we construe it as sacrifice, we're saying in some way he's in some way standing in for the person and the animal. So he's not, strictly speaking, the animal that gets taken to put on the altar. He's somehow the person, he's substituting in for the person, offering perfect worship on their behalf. In some way, and then we'll talk about this really on Good Friday, in some way that actually eliminates the need for further sacrifices to happen. So it's the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. So this is something I added in. I think this is going to help us hold the picture a little more tightly. So for sacrifice, and for each of these, I'm going to have a sphere, a need, what it does, and a result. So it kind of maps onto the questions we talked about, like who's involved, how does the mechanism work? So for sacrifice, we're talking about the sphere of worship. And the problem is there's defilement. So ritual defilement in some case. That's what all the Levitical sacrifices are aimed at for the most part, especially the burnt offering. And Jesus' work makes sacrifice, and so it moves things from defiled to purified. And that's a necessary thing. And so it's capturing part of what happens in the atonement, but that's obviously not everything that happens. But it's one aspect of it. There's a defilement because of sin. In Leviticus, it's because of uncleanness. Those are not synonymous. You can be unclean and sin don't mean exactly the same thing, but they're two different things that are related to defilement. There's some type of purification that needs to happen. So in Leviticus, it's unclean things need to be made clean. And once they're made clean, then they can be made holy. So clean, again, I know cleanliness is next to godliness, but clean and holy are not synonymous either. They're two different categories. Clean is just, neutral is probably not the right word, but it's something like neutral. It's something that's clean can either lapse into uncleanness because of ritual defilement, or it can be made holy. But an unclean thing can't go from unclean to holy. It has to be purified first, and then it can be made holy, set apart for some sort of specific use. So this is a little bit of review from last week, but is this picture kind of coming together? Questions so far? Okay, let's jump to Victor. I think we spent more time on this last week, talking about the victor picture is Jesus defeats our enemies for us and wins the battle. So again, there's a substitutionary element happening. I can't fight the battle for myself, therefore Jesus taps in and fights the battle for me and defeats the enemies that I am not capable of defeating on my own. We talked about how Genesis 3:15, there's this prediction of the man who's 3:15 is, I will put enmity, this is God talking, I'll put enmity between you and the woman and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. So this, some sort of conflict between the serpent and the son of Adam is set up in Genesis that then gets resolved in some way in the crucifixion. And I think we could say, we looked at a little bit at Colossians 2:13 through 15, where Paul says, and you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. And then the key part of the verse is he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. So the he in that 15, he disarmed the rulers, would be God the Father, put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him, meaning God the Son. And you can take the verse two different ways. On the surface, the rulers and authorities could refer strictly to the Romans and the Jewish, the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, because those are the rulers and authorities that were shamed by, they put Jesus to death for blasphemy or political insurrection, but then if he gets resurrected a few days later, then that shows them as incompetent to deal with the problem. Welcome.
I'm sorry, I was
We're sort of reviewing. We talked about this last week a little bit. And so the thing that's new, though, is let's put it in kind of in this same framework. So the sphere is warfare. The idea of, battle is a big imagery throughout the Old Testament and even into the New. There's enemies. In Colossians, it's rulers and authorities. Elsewhere, Paul will talk about principalities and powers. And we use that language in Ephesians. Jesus' death does something that defeats those enemies on my behalf, with the result being I'm no longer enslaved to sin or, in some medieval accounts, Satan. So there's a different kind of way of construing victor in terms of ransom imagery. We might talk about that. Well, I'll talk about it a little bit now, but there's different ways of construing it, some of which are problematic. One way of construing it was somehow God had to make a payment to Satan to then free people from bondage. You can get there in certain passages if you read them a certain type of way, but it makes it seem it's a little too dualistic. It makes it seem as if God and Satan are kind of both equal rulers and authorities, and because Satan has a claim to people, God has to pay Satan off to redeem people out of bondage. When instead, this is saying there's some kind of power sin, Satan, demons has that is undercut and defeated by what Jesus does on the cross. So that's different than saying he has to pay a debt to them. If anything, the debt language is a debt that we would owe to God that then Jesus pays on our behalf. So some sort of penalty associated with sin gets paid off by Jesus, but the devil's not involved in that transaction. Does it make sense for the most part? There's a rabbit trail we could go down that we're just not going to go down of medieval construals of things that make more sense in a feudal society with peasants and serfs and lords and ladies and that sort of thing. But if you're interested, I can give you things to read. So, well, actually, before we go further, questions on sacrifice or victory as pictures? You can have comments too. You don't have to just have questions. Not yet. Okay. You're thinking about it. You'll get there.
I'm trying to behave.
Yeah, you can have like I told you, you can have as many questions as you want. Yeah. I'll stand by that. You can have as many questions. I'm not gonna walk that back. Okay, next picture. And this is, I've already alluded to this, but this is a good example of the legal substitute picture. We're moving into the sphere of law. But this concept of substitution was at work in both of the previous pictures. So this is kind of illustrating how these, in some ways, they're separate pictures, but in other ways, they're kind of mutually informing or even mutually indwelling. So this is a substitute in a legal sense, but Christ was substituting as a warrior on my behalf in the victor picture. He's substituting as a sacrifice on my behalf, or a worshiper on my behalf in the other picture. But this is, when people think of substitutionary atonement, this is more what they're thinking of. It's Jesus obeying the law perfectly on our behalf and then paying the penalty that we owe. So it's kind of a two-part. And the way it kind of works together, and this is why an account of the atonement is incomplete without the life of Jesus in between an incarnation and crucifixion. He had to, and this is also too why it wouldn't have worked. I don't know if you remember from a couple weeks ago when we talked about why couldn't Jesus have just died because Herod put him to death as a baby, and then that somehow accomplishes what he needed to accomplish. And that's because he wouldn't have grown to maturity and lived a sinless life and been obedient in ways that we're not obedient, and thus his record of perfect obedience gets credited to my account, and my record of disobedience gets credited to his account. But that crediting language is already kind of metaphorical. Now we're moving into sort of a legal territory. As you could imagine, the way of kind of thinking about it like this, it has roots in Scripture, particularly Isaiah 53 and Mark 10. But the emphasis on the legal sphere really gets developed in the Reformation period, in the 16th century, give or take. Part of that is because the understanding of law develops in that period of time in a way that's more modern. So the way we think about law today has a lot of continuity with the 16th century. It doesn't have a lot of continuity with the way ancient people would have thought about law in the Bible, for instance. So we talk about the law of Moses, but we're using the word Torah, which is a Hebrew word that really means instruction more than law. But you can see how those things overlap. The law kind of tells you what to do, what not to do. But Torah is a broader concept than just law. It's not just do this, don't that. It's actually teaching you how to think about living, Whereas our legal codes are merely just exhaustive descriptions of what you can and can't do. You don't read them to kind of suss out the logic in some ways. I guess you could, because hopefully there is a logic there. But they're way more exhaustive than anything we have in the Old Testament in particular, which is, if you read through Exodus 21 through 25, those are the laws that show up after the Ten Commandments. They seem kind of like a hodgepodge. There's all sorts of things, and they seem also kind of unrelated. There's laws about building parapets around the corners of the roof of your house, which I'm sure we've all done at some point in our life, right? Laws about how to deal with an ox that gores people, very practical. It's interesting, the ox is held morally liable after a second infraction. But the person who owns the ox is too, depending on whether they built a fence around it. But needless to say,
And like a dog bite.
maybe the equivalent today. But so, what are you doing there to make that connection?
The second offense.
Yeah, what's the continuity between a dog biting people and an ox goring
Because
people?
the second time the dog bites, they can take it out and kill it. I mean, that's understanding, I haven't
Yeah.
had to do that.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, once is an accident, twice is a pattern. Is maybe a way of looking at it.
All of these levels, though, seem to me they're certainly valid points, but the bottom line is that Jesus is God,
Mm.
Son of God. God, he says he is one with the Father.
Mm-hmm.
And so any sacrifice or substitution he makes has got to be perfect
Mm-hmm.
by itself. So, and because perfect, complete,
Mm-hmm.
all encompassing, and that's why, obeys the law perfectly on our behalf, but he supersedes the law.
Sure.
That's it. I mean,
Yeah.
the law goes out the window as a result of that. Not among early Christians, perhaps, as Galatians points out,
Right.
but, at this point, the atonement has got to be complete because he who is providing the atonement is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
We aren't, never can be,
Right.
but he that's it. Whenever you bring these things up, I think back on that basic premise.
Sure. And I think, yeah, so that's at a high theological level, you would want to affirm that. I think what's going on here, though, is in order for us to really grasp the significance of what he's doing, it has to connect at the ground level, which is why you have all these different pictures, and you don't have the gospel writers just coming out and say, well, actually, he's God, and therefore, what you just said.
The point that you made about a different understanding by the time of the Reformation and the so-called humanistic movement that was going on at the same time,
Mm.
with people like Erasmus, for instance. It couldn't have been that understanding, and I find that very interesting. Couldn't have been that understanding in like 700 AD, after the fall of the Roman Empire, and
Right.
just basically chaos in the world.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I'm trying to work through in a dissertation, but also just sort of make sense of, is it's part of a bigger question of how does the way we understand doctrine rightfully change as history progresses. So it obviously changes because the way we think about atonement in the 21st century is not identical to the way the first century did. So what are the changes that are actually drawing out more of what the text can mean versus the changes that are sort of reading into it? Well, this is what I mentioned earlier with the ransom idea, and it makes sense in a feudal society, but it kind of distorts some texts.
Point, because what you're saying is interpretation has changed the concept of the atonement. The atonement doesn't change, but the concept of it does, and I think that's an interesting idea. And then you get into the 19th century with the liberalization of what was done during the Reformation.
Sure, yeah. So what we're trying to figure out, I don't know if we're really going to get, we're not going to get there today, I don't know if we'll get there next week, is some of these pictures resonate more than others depending on where society is. So you could say, if we go back to the other one's the most overtly supernatural. Now we're talking about a cosmic battle picture between God and the forces of evil. That might not resonate as much in a 21st century context where people don't even think there is a spiritual realm. So to try to lead with this kind of cosmic warfare going on. The famous quote, and I'm not going to get the quote right, but it's a big New Testament scholar in the early 20th century named Rudolf Bultmann. Basically, the idea was, how could we believe in supernatural things when we have microwaves and cars and all these other technological advances? And on the one hand, he was doing that as part of a project of demythologizing the Bible, so trying to strip out all the supernatural elements to kind of get at what the core teaching was. But on the other hand, he does kind of have a point from a presentation perspective of, you probably don't lead with that because that doesn't connect with the way people think about the world today. So it doesn't automatically mean they're right and you've got to shift to the way they think, but it does mean you need to take what are people's felt needs into account. Early first century, there's a lot more supernatural ways of thinking about the world. So to speak to this idea of a cosmic battle resonates with people in a way that it doesn't today. But that's why we have the different pictures, and I think we need to understand all of them and how they all fit together, but we might lead with one versus the other. So this one's kind of controversial in some sense, for reasons we won't fully get into, but this idea of having to obey the law and pay a penalty, the really strong legal element, I don't know if it resonates as much now as it did in the past several centuries, which is the way people think about these sorts of things. But one way of negatively misconstruing this, let me see if we can, is it actually going to, move ahead. So this language of condemnation and justification, that's borrowing from the legal realm. So to be justified is to be declared not guilty, or to be declared in the right. One of the things that's, especially for the passage like this, but other passages as well, one of the things that's difficult for interpretation for us today is we have a word for right and righteous, and we have a word for just and justice, but the biblical word is the same word. It's just the same thing. Their concepts overlap a lot more than ours do. So sometimes we don't have a word that means, we do. You could say to right-wise something, meaning to make it right, but that's weird. I don't know why you would say it that way, but in Greek, you have a way of saying to right-wise a person, and we have to bring it into English as to justify them. So if you're justified, you're vindicated, declared in the right. Previously, you were condemned or guilty, then you're declared not guilty. And that can be accomplished in several ways. One of them is for the penalty. If you're guilty before the court, somebody has to pay the penalty on your behalf. And I think to John's point, the way that has been construed is I have an infinite debt that I can't pay because of my sins, so some sort of infinite payment must be made in order to satisfy the debt. And since I can't do that, and only someone who has no debt of their own can do that, that's where we think of Jesus' his perfect life and his death going together. So by his perfect life, he doesn't accrue any debt because he doesn't sin, so there's no debt of his own to pay, but he accrues perfect track record. But then because of that perfect track record, he can then pay the penalty that I couldn't otherwise pay.
So in Leviticus, where they have all the different animals you have to sacrifice to get right with God, because Jesus died, then we don't have to do that. Is that correct?
That's one way, yes. But that's a different sphere. So that goes back to the sacrifice, and they do overlap, but it goes back to the sacrifices It's partly an act of worship. It's partly a paying of a penalty. So I think it's better to think of what the Israelites are doing in the sacrificial system is they're paying a penalty via the animal that they bring to the altar. So in that situation, the animal's not being punished per se. Bless you.
Thank you.
Some accounts of the atonement picture it as the person is supposed to be punished, but instead of the person being punished, the animal is being punished. But that's blending punishment and penalty, and those are two different categories. They can overlap, but it's better to think of it as the infraction, the defilement, the sin, whatever, generates a penalty. If the penalty is not paid, then there will be punishment. So, an example, I guess I could use myself. So, shortly after moving to Sanford, I had got to know the Sanford PD a little too well because of getting a ticket on celery because I tried to go around a car that was turning left, but it was in a school zone and my tires entered the crosswalk, of which no one was nearby, but it was a crosswalk, it was a school zone. It was during school hours, or it was when the lights are flashing, and there was a cop sitting right there. So all the things conspired against me. So I get a ticket, right? So the ticket is a penalty because of my infraction. But if I pay the penalty and take traffic school, which out of spite, I did not watch any video whatsoever. I just scrolled through everything and then took the test. Because I actually looked up the infraction and it was very ambiguous, but I felt like if I tried to argue it in a court, it would somehow come against me. And so I just like, oh, I don't think I actually violated the code that's on my ticket, but in any case, I'm going to pay the penalty so life can move on. But if I didn't pay the penalty, what was going to happen? Yeah, there's a punishment would be, so the penalty wouldn't go away. The penalty would be there, but then my license gets suspended or the points are assessed. So you think of the points being assessed, that's like a punishment. So it's a strike against you. You can't do anything about it. The ticket, it's just you pay the ticket and it goes away. So when we think about the atonement, we want to think more in terms of Jesus paying a penalty, not Jesus being punished. Especially in this realm. He's living a perfect life, so he doesn't have any penalties. I didn't live a perfect life. I have lots of penalties. My penalties will then lead ultimately to punishment in the form of death. But Jesus pays the penalty on my behalf, so then I don't. There's a different way I could probably say that, but his death becomes my death, and then his resurrection becomes my resurrection too. So there's this union with Christ that happens by faith, as the reformers are gonna talk about. But too easily, and it's because the language is penal substitutionary atonement. So that language, penal can mean punish, but it can also mean to penalize, to have a penalty drawn against. But there are, I think, unhelpful versions of it where it makes it seem like God is beating up Jesus on my behalf because he would rather beat me up, but instead he's gonna beat up Jesus. And there's ways you could construe it as divine child abuse, depending on how you think of the relation between, and that's not my language. That's published language in books and articles and that sort of thing. But I think it all stems from misunderstanding what's actually going on and thinking in terms of what the picture is actually depicting. It's depicting a penalty being paid, not a punishment being meted out. There's actually just for reference, make sure I say this right, there's no text in Scripture that unambiguously depicts an innocent person being punished on somebody else's behalf. But an innocent person can pay the penalty on somebody else's behalf.
Interesting thing is, though, that the high priests in the Sanhedrin, I guess, says that one man must die it is right for one man to die for the community. Israel in their view. Right? And they say that prior to Christ's death.
Yeah.
They say, well, sacrifice him. It's probably to appease the Romans,
Right.
who really, if you believe what Pontius Pilate is saying, they didn't need to be.
Right. They didn't want political insurrection, but they don't particularly care. I mean, the Jewish leaders wanted to put him to death for blasphemy. The Romans don't care about that sort of thing, but they don't want people getting all out of sorts and rioting and causing other problems. So if this will shut everybody up, then let's do this.
It's the corrupt bargain.
Yeah.
What about the concubine at the end of Judges? She was innocent, got punished because of what the dudes did.
Well, she had violence inflicted against her. That's different than being punished.
Well, I mean, like, not that part when he killed her and chopped her up and set her to pieces.
Right. But that's still not punishment, though.
It's the same, Mel's dead.
He's not. The other way of thinking of it is he's not pouring out wrath. Not on her though, especially because she's dead at that point. That's the other piece of it, is distinguishing violence and punishment overlap, because punishment usually involves violence of some kind, but all violence is not the same as punishment. But they're all kind of, so at the same time, I'm not suggesting the cross wasn't violent. There's a violence involved in nailing somebody to a cross. You could construe it as, in the Romans' mind, they are inflicting punishment because that's what they relished in crucifixion. But that's different. That's not this picture per se. It's also not the sacrifice picture either. It gets tricky. This is why people can keep writing books about it and dissertations and articles, and because you're trying to do three things at once. You're trying to make sense of what does the Bible say about it in both the Old and New Testaments. What have theologians and church historians and other people thought about it? And then how, in light of all that, how do we think about it today, given our own cultural context and understanding of these things? And because you're always, we're just in one cultural context, 21st century, American, Floridian, Central Florida. Like, you can kind of get real specific on the context, but time changes the context, geography changes the context. So as long as the world keeps turning and people keep hearing the gospel, there's still going to be new ways to think through how do we make sense of some of these things. But the tricky part is how do we come to new understandings without discarding everything about old ones? So you're trying to retain part of the old, but you're doing a fresh rendition of it. The best example, not the best example, it was just one I've written a paper about, so that's why I guess it's best in my mind, because I can recall it pretty quick. I wrote a paper in the fall for my history of doctrine class that was trying to make sense of how can doctrine change but not change. So the Atonement is a great example. We would say, the significance of Christ's death for us doesn't change, but our understanding of it does. Maybe even our presentation of it does. And because I was writing this paper in December, it was Christmas time, and I like to listen to Vince Guaraldi's soundtrack to A Charlie Brown Christmas, just classic Christmas album. But on there, he has a version of What Child Is This? That is, after he gets past the intro, it's very unmistakably What Child Is This? But in some ways, it has no harmonic overlap with the 15th century carol called Greensleeves that then had lyrics written to it that becomes the Christmas song, What Child Is This? His version of it is way jazzier. It's in a different key. He plays with the time signature a little bit. Lots of improvisation, but as you're listening to it, you're like, oh, well, that's What Child Is This? But it's a version of it that couldn't have existed prior to the invention of jazz, prior to the jazz trio being a thing with drums, upright bass, and guitar. So even if somebody in the 16th, 17th century had wanted to re-envision Greensleeves as a jazzy version of What Child Is This, it wasn't even possible. But now that he's done it in the mid-20th century, people can reproduce his version of it, or they could even improvise on it further. And there's different ways you could do it. So just the music to me is a flexible thing you can use because there's a way to remix, rearrange, reharmonize songs to where you can tell, oh, that's that song, but it doesn't sound like the first version of it that I heard. It's very noticeably different. There's a YouTuber named Mac Glocky who does this at an even more. You have to really appreciate 90s rock to really get what he's doing. But he'll redo a song from one artist in the style of a different artist, and it sounds like that artist covered that song. But he's changing a lot of stuff when he does that. But it's a lot of times it's two artists that have no sonic relationship to each other, and somehow he's able to swap it, and you're like, oh yeah, it's very unmistakably that song, but it sounds like that artist playing it. I don't know how he replicates all the voices. Like it sounds like, oh, that's the singer for that band. It's like, no, it's just that guy. So that to me illustrates kind of what we're doing here of like, we're trying to talk about the atonement. We're trying to make sense of it. We're using these different pictures to kind of put the puzzle together. But the way we might do it here and now is not a definitive once for all, this is the way you have to think about it from now on. It's just, this is the way we're thinking about it right now, given our best resources for thinking through it. So let me hit one more, and then that actually gets us right at the halfway point. Didn't say it in so many words, but just so we have the sphere need work result. We're in the legal sphere. We're thinking of a courtroom. We stand condemned. We've sped through a school zone or inadvertently driven through the crosswalk. We can't afford the ticket because it's not just the $150. It's an infinite amount of penalty. Jesus pays this penalty on our behalf. Therefore, we stand in the realm of the court, justified, declared not guilty, even though we did do the things. The result of Jesus's substituting for us in this sphere is that we get declared not guilty. So we did sacrifice, victor, and substitute. Next week we'll look at, I think we might have 4 next week actually, because we should have 7. That's more holy. So 3. So we have reconciler, redeemer. Maybe it is just 6. I'll have to come up with a 7th one, right? Because you can't stop at just 6. But it's reconciler, redeemer, and the second Adam picture are going to be the 3 that we'll cover next week. And I think that'll kind of give us at least a broad understanding of how people have tried to make sense of the atonement leading up to Easter, and then maybe some of the things through Holy Week and on Easter will pop out in HD a little bit more to you. You'll have to let me know if they do. But any questions before we wrap up and head over?
Something that had never occurred to me before, but the fact that God chose that particular time and that particular place, there had been other times when punishment would have been a matter of cutting off the head, or throwing somebody in a volcano. There had to be a whole body, and there had to be a particular manner of burial.
Yeah.
So if Christ had been buried as we bury people today, resurrection might have been somewhat more difficult. Execution on the cross, you have a whole body.
Yeah. And it's a public display of execution. So it's not, like you said, we're not just tossing somebody We're not burying somebody alive. We're not tossing somebody into a fire somewhere that, now we don't know where the body is afterwards because it's been disintegrated. I think that's why they both go together. The manner of death is significant. It had to be, for reasons I think we talked about a few weeks ago, the symbolism that comes with a cross, but then also the fact that it was a political execution. So he's being identified with a political prisoner in ways. So that's a different sphere entirely. Maybe that'll be our seventh sphere. But then, to be able to, not just to have the method of burial available, but to have someone who has a tomb that they were probably going to personally use that then they make available. But the method of burial of wrapping the body in these linens that are going to get anointed with spices. And so then, there's a physical body, it's put into a physical tomb, it's sealed with a stone. And so then there's actually a way to verify, well, the options are he was resurrected or the disciples stole the body. But there aren't options of, well, it just disintegrated because he was burned too much or something like that. So the body was trackable from Friday to Sunday in a way that previous styles of execution might not have allowed for. And even, I don't know about later points in time, but it just underscores the fullness of time language that I think Paul uses of, we have this language that almost everybody in the world speaks. We have this system of roads that connects the entire world. And that's part of why, this is a different topic, but that's part of why Jesus does a lot of ministry in Galilee, is Galilee is a Gentile crossroads in that road system. So there's more people coming through Galilee as opposed to Jerusalem. You got to be going to Jerusalem because you have business there. Galilee, you can just be passing through. So the fact that he's doing ministry where he's doing it's already setting it up for a spread of a message that wouldn't have been possible a few centuries prior. Could have been still possible a few centuries later, but it's all these little things kind of coming together.
Out of curiosity, all the other people that were being crucified at that time, what happened to those bodies?
From what I understand, if you didn't have someone who took ownership of and disposed of your body, I think they just got tossed into a pit. So that's why it's important that Joseph of Arimathea says, "Hey, we'll use my tomb. We'll come take care of the body." But they usually languished a lot longer. The fact that Jesus takes place within a single day is unusual. There's just a lot of things about it just that are lined up fairly remarkably. I mean, the fact that they didn't have to break his legs. So it talked, you have these passages about no bone being broken, and then he gives up his spirit before the soldiers can come along and break his legs, but they do for the other two, and then we don't know right off what happens to the other two, but presumably if they're just petty criminals, nobody's coming for them to do something for any kind of proper burial. But, all right, let me close. I should close in prayer. I always forget to do that because I'm used to classroom, and the bell. I was just telling Gail brought it up, and I was like, the bell rings and everyone scatters is kind of the way I'm used to it. But let me pray for us, and then we'll head over to service. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for allowing us time to gather together like this to look at your word, to look at the theology around the atonement and how we understand the significance of Christ's death for us as well as his resurrection for us. We just hope that you ask that you continue to help us understand these topics in more detail and how they apply to us in this Easter season. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.